Everyone, and welcome back to UK Liber TV. One of the most exciting and perhaps uplifting aspects of this moment we're living in right now is that it's easier than ever to challenge historical narratives that in years past have been untouchable. The historian Darryl Cooper landed himself in some controversy on Tucker Carlson's show for going after perhaps the most protected of historical narratives, that of World War II and Winston Churchill's. Joining me to discuss some of the wider Winston Churchill and World War II issues, it's a returning guest to the show. You know him, you love him. It's Mr. Godfrey Bloom. Welcome back to the show, sir. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you very much indeed, and looking forward to this discussion.
Excellent. Good. Well, it's certainly an important one. Now, unfortunately, I do have to preface this conversation because an increasing number of people on the internet suffer from binary brain and are unable to distinguish things. So I have to put a warning label. Maybe you could comment on the fact that I actually have to do this and how ridiculous it is. Criticism of Winston Churchill, his prime ministership, his leadership during World War II, his generalship during any of the conflicts in which he served, does not equal endorsement of the other guy with the mustache. Criticism of Churchill or any of the Allied powers does not equal endorsement of any of the atrocities that the Axis committed, doesn't mitigate or downplay anything they did. Yeah, are you with me on this so far?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Good. Right. Now, you took part, I think it was a year ago or so now, with Bo Dade from the Lotus Eaters. You had a conversation with him about the First World War, and you touched on Churchill's kind of emerging role in that then, which I highly recommend everyone go and check out. And I can't remember exactly what you said, so forgive me for butchering the line a little bit, but you said something along the lines of, well, it's been difficult for me as an old geezer to have to rethink Churchill, because obviously I grew up with him as this kind of great man, and you were saying something along the lines of, well, as I've got older, I've kind of reanalyzed his leadership, his prime ministership, and everything about him during World War II. Obviously, Darryl Cooper landed himself in some hot water with Tucker Carlson after, going after our most sacred of figures, Winston Churchill. Yeah, I guess kind of broad brushstrokes then. Where do you stand on Churchill at the moment then? Should we revere him as this, saintly figure? Or is he the man that, lost half of Europe to Stalin and wasn't necessarily that great prime minister? What are your thoughts?
Well, let's set out who I am and what I do. I'm a published military historian. I lecture on military history. I'm an associate member of the Royal College of Defence Studies. I've lectured at the Eisenhower Defence Academy, the Joint Services Academy in Shrivenham. So I am, if you will, a professional observer of these matters historically. I don't take one view or another particularly, and I don't say somebody is all bad or somebody is all good or somebody didn't make any mistakes. So I like to take an objective view. Certainly, as the son of a fighter pilot in World War II and a WAF mother, where Churchill was a wartime leader hero, I didn't start reassessing until I was in my early 20s, when funnily enough, I read The World Crisis by Winston Churchill, which was a very long First World War apology or disassociation from him having anything to do with the bellicosity in 1914, which of course was absurd. So I'm an analyst of what he did, how he handled things, and like the curious egg, he was good in parts. But the view is, I think, and this is not my view, and it isn't for me to say, but all his chief of staffs and his senior military commanders in World War II, for example, made the same. Took the same view. Alan Brooke, for example, who was his chief of staff all the time through the war, said we would not have won the war without Churchill, and I think that is possibly true. That's possibly true. However, my argument is we shouldn't have been in the bloody war to start with. I'm a big believer. I'm not a pacifist. I have a military service background, very undistinguished, I have to say. But I was a soldier, and I was with NATO, so on and so forth. Wars benefit nobody. Wars are bad things per se. Wars are always bad. You very rarely have to fight a war historically that you had to fight. And they are generally quite small wars, which were unavoidable. Most of the big wars that we've had are not those. So I would argue, for example, we had to fight the Falklands War because it was a crown colony invaded by a fascist junta in Argentina, who had no legal claim to the Falkland Islands at all and still don't. As anybody with a modicum of historical knowledge will know that. You can look it up. You can just look it up, easy peasy. It was never part of the Argentine at all. So that was a war that had to be fought. Sometimes you have to fight a war because the bully boy has actually attacked you, and that has to be dealt with. Otherwise, you soon go down the slippery slope to everybody having a pop at you. The great wars that we fought are not necessary. The War of the Spanish Succession was not necessary. The Napoleonic Wars were not necessary. The Great War was a disaster and totally unnecessary. And of course, the Second World War was just an extension of the first. They were one war, they came in two parts. So there's no point in trying to sort of start your theory in 1935 whether we should have gone to war or not. It started in 1914. But of course, generally speaking, most people don't have the benefit of a traditional historical education, and it's almost disappearing now. State education is a disastrous joke. And unless you take a real serious interest, and people do, they don't know what they're talking about. So generally speaking, your man on the Clapham omnibus hasn't got a bloody clue. So his opinions are a waste of time. So you really need to drill down to find out what's what. So you find that Churchill made fundamentally strategic mistakes when it came to the war. He did some good things in the Great War, and he did some good leadership, pure leadership things in the Second War, if you want to call it the Second War or Part Two. But they always came with Churchill's baggage, which is very poor strategic decisions militarily. But everybody makes those. Napoleon made those. Everybody makes those. So I don't hold him as the icon that I did in the 60s when I was a young man coming from the family background that I did. He made mistakes, but the fundamental mistake he made, which you can't gloss over, is he took us to a war which we didn't need to fight. And that was the problem. As I say, I'm not a pacifist. But if you drill down, let's say, and look at the situation in Poland, which actually brought us to war, not under Churchill, of course, but under Chamberlain, when we went to war, supposedly for Poland. And if you look at the geopolitical scenario in Poland in 1938-39, you'll find that, A, it wasn't necessary. Concessions could have been made, and they weren't made. Nobody knows about this. Nobody understands this. Everybody thinks about Munich and Czechoslovakia. They don't think about 1939 in Poland. They don't do their homework. So these are the problems that we have. People make decisions that based on a lack of knowledge. And this is how sort of heroism and war heroes and so on, so that comes about. So you need to analyze these things. And if you look at what was the war aim, let's have a look at what was the war aim. Let's go to 1939. Fast forward from 1914 to 1930. You have a situation. Why did we go to war? Well, I would argue, and indeed Churchill would have argued and did argue, it was the preservation of the British Empire or the British Commonwealth and the British way of life and our freedoms that we enjoyed as an island nation. Now, we went to war in 1939, admittedly, I say, under Chamberlain. Were those war aims successful? Did we achieve that? And the answer is no. The empire went, the Commonwealth became a little bit of a waste of time, but okay, let's go with it. The principles of English law, parliamentary democracy, all these things have all gone. They've gone. And you might argue that they started to go in 1914, but they certainly went in 1939 because we ended up with a rabid socialist government in 1945. which began the great welfare state demise of our country, which carries on today, and the corruption that goes with it. So, was Churchill a great hero? No, not really. He wasn't. But that isn't a personal thing. I'm having a go at Churchill or Churchill's name. He did some good things. He was a great patriot, but he was totally misguided because he failed. He failed. And if you look at 1945 map of Europe, failure screams at you. Nothing that we went to war for was achieved. It was a disaster. And we saw the world split into two hemispheres, the Americans on one side and the Soviet Union on the other, both, I would argue, disastrous countries. The Soviet Union was an evil regime, and the United States, and it's being proven more every day today, is a stupid regime. The people in Washington are fundamentally retarded. And we're in the piggy in the middle with no power, no army, no nothing. And it started in 1939 when we got involved in a war which was nothing to do with us.
Folks, I have just one question for you.
Do you think gold is money?
If, like the great Dr. Ron Paul, you understand the historic and economic significance of gold, then you're going to want to head on over to Gold Bullion Partners. If you're ready to start storing your wealth by putting precious metals to work for you, you have to check out Gold Bullion Partners. Gold Bullion Partners, you are going to get help investing that is personalised, bespoke and expertly curated according to your individual needs. With dedicated in-house specialists, Gold Bullion Partners will guide you through every step of the process. In a world where central bank digital currencies loom and all the tyranny that comes with it, Gold Bullion Partners' sole mission is to empower you to invest with confidence whilst promoting fiscal autonomy in a world of ever-increasing state control of the money supply. So click the link in the description box down below to get started on your journey to financial independence. Now back to the video. What you were saying there about where you start the story is so important. Like you say, everyone wants to start at, maybe Munich, Chamberlain the weakling, Chamberlain the appeaser. Everyone was starting in 1938 or, maybe invasion of Poland or something like that. No one wants to have this conversation from 1933, from 1914 and analyze the bigger geopolitical picture that led to this, as you say, extension of the First World War. What was it Ferdinand Foch said from the French general? This is not of the Treaty of Versailles, said something like, this is not a peace treaty. It's simply an armistice for 20 years. And, how right he was then. And yeah, it's interesting.
I think that was down to Pershing. I think that was General Pershing that said.
Pershing, sorry, my bad there. Thank you. And what you were saying there about our objectives is even more true then. As you said there about the protection of the empire, no one will argue the case that Britain's empire was in a better state post the war than it was before the war. No one's going to argue that at all. And even if you were to take the case, well, we did it so nobly because we wanted to protect Poland, so we launched the war guarantee. We issued the war guarantee with Poland on, I think it was March 31st, 1939. But of course, it wasn't a war guarantee at all, was it? Because Germany invades on the 1st of September. But everyone always forgets that 15 days later, on the 16th of September, the Russians invaded as well. So don't tell me it was to guarantee Polish sovereignty. All this was simply warmongering with the Germans. Now, there's not to justify the German invasion of Poland or the Soviet invasion of Poland, for that matter, but it certainly wasn't to protect anything to do with Poland. What do you make of this kind of this whitewashing of it, of this forgetting about Stalin for 4 years, which is essentially what happened? So, Stalin's the villain throughout the 30s, and then magically from 1941 through to 1945, he's our mate, and then he's back to the villain again. I think probably Stalin certainly is the very clear victor of this war. What do you make of this kind of rewriting of the narrative so that, the Soviets almost come out clean?
Well, of course, war history is always written by the victors. Of course, this is a truism that you write it up as you see it, and that's one of the great problems that we have in schools. But now, of course, in this country, the degradation of our history is now part of the state apparatus, and there was a recent assessment of that, where more than 50% of young people are not proud of their history as a nation of Great Britain. And that's quite deliberate. That's not an accident, because certainly in every state school, every teacher will hate this country and hate this country's history. We have a government that hates this country and hates this country's history. So they're not taught. Children today aren't taught about the great movement in Britain, anti-slavery movement in Britain, and the way that we actually put that across in the world, and the Royal Navy patrolled that, and we did all sorts of things. We're not given credit for any of that. We're only given credit for being part of the slave trade in the late 1800s, and so on and so forth. So we're not given any credit for what we did after, subsequently. For example, when we got rid of 1834, I think it was 1834, when we got rid of slavery in the British Empire. And of course, it was nearly 30 years before America came to that conclusion, and they needed a war. We paid compensation. We were very much better organized at doing that, and we led the world. We get no credit for that. And that's crazy. The history of the British Empire has its flaws. Of course, as every empire does, mistakes are made, sometimes quite big mistakes. But broadly speaking, the British Empire was a force for good. And you'll be vilified if you say that. I should be vilified for saying that. But if you look at a map of the world today, and if you are as traveled as I am, that's not because I'm particularly clever or gifted, I'm just old. So I've been everywhere. I've been all over the world. And there are very few places in the British Commonwealth that I have not visited. Very few. And I'm always made welcome as an Englishman by everybody, all the time. If we were so bad, why am I made so welcome? And of course, if you go to the Indian subcontinent and you look at the railways, which we built, if you look at the ordnance surveying that went on, which we did, when we look at the buildings, the sanitation, the democracy as it stands, which is a debatable thing in its own right, all these things we gave to the Indian subcontinent. Unfortunately, we gave the Indian subcontinent socialism in 1945, 46, 47, and they followed our lead on that, which was a terrible mistake. If we had handed them a free society and capitalism, like we did Hong Kong under John Cooperthwaite. Now, if you look at the progress that economy made, okay, it's a small economy, but it's an extraordinary story. And John Cooperthwaite, and under the British Empire, he said, my job is to make sure, the drains work and the police aren't corrupt. And that's it. That's all I need to do. Everything else is down to an entrepreneurial free society, which of course is what Erhard did in post-war Germany. He said, we've had enough socialism, national socialism. I'm going to let the German people sort it out. And they overtook us. Hong Kong overtook us. And all these people, they overtook us because they took a step back and said, running a country, all our job of running a country is just to actually free people to get on about their business and let people sort themselves out under a rule of law, under the protection of law, not the protection of regulation. We are now regulated up to the gunnels. We don't need regulation. We need to revert to caveat emptor and common law, perfectly straightforward. And wherever you see government involved, you see failure in the world, not just the United Kingdom. Where government involves itself, everything fails because politicians as a genre are stupid people. And I know, I spent 10 years in politics and I spent most of my life in the city of London, dealing with people who are very, very clever indeed, very sharp, very entrepreneurial. And when I came into politics, I suddenly realized I was dealing with people who are retarded. We have a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's retarded, as was her predecessor. It doesn't matter whether you vote red or blue, you still get the same stupidity and corruption. And we're in the shit again, aren't we? We're in the shit again. And this time we're doing it to ourselves. And it doesn't matter what the thing is. You just need somebody. You need to bring common sense back into government, and it's got to be small government at that. No evidence of that at all. We have this Chancellor of the Exchequer now, who's making it very difficult indeed for non-dons in this country from taxation point of view, and we'll see more in the October budget. They're leaving. What she doesn't understand, and no chancellors understand, especially socialist chancellors don't understand, is if you raise the tax bar too high, if you make tax too crippling and regulation too crippling, people just go. People just go. Now, your poor old middle class and your working class in this country can't go, but billionaires and entrepreneurs, they just go. We've got the highest electricity prices in the world at the moment. So businesses are going to go. Businesses won't start. We don't know what's not starting that would have otherwise started. And of course, that's where you look at Bastiat, Frederick Bastiat. It's the unseen. A good economist can judge what is happening, which isn't immediate to the eye. So if you chase these people away by high regulation and taxation, and so we go into a downward spiral, which requires more regulation. And we, of course, got Trump in North America talking about tariffs. He is saying, oh, we need plenty of tariffs now on Chinese goods, so on and so forth. Because what he's actually saying is we can't make stuff as cheaply and as good as the Chinese. So we're going to actually burden this trade with tariffs. But what he doesn't understand is who pays tariffs? Who pays the tariff? It's the ordinary working Joe. He pays it. He pays it. And it's the same here. If you put a tariff on something, it's the punter who pays, not the Chinese. The Chinese won't pay the tariff. They might sell fewer cars, but who's going to pay it? It's Joe Sixpack. You couldn't invent the stupidity of the average Western politician.
It's interesting. You kind of, obviously, we've sort of digressed a little bit from World War II there, and your sort of analysis of the British Empire is certainly refreshing. I mean, you only need to look at the record of the West Africa Squadron, which you were referencing there, the section of the Royal Navy, the full sixth of the Royal Navy that was dedicated to preventing the slave trade at a time when we were still locked in a life and death struggle with Napoleon. Something like 1,500 soldiers died in like over a 50-year period trying to prevent the slave trade. So yeah, that certainly goes unknown by or untaught. And yeah, your other kind of references of what the British Empire accomplished on the subcontinent and across the world are not known or not taught or not celebrated as well. But no, it's just interesting the way we kind of digressed into a conversation about sort of post-war socialism. I mean, this is the thing where I think I don't think people have, to bring this back round to Churchill then, I don't think people have connected these dots yet, where obviously the justification for defeating Hitler was that we need to implement socialism in this country during World War II, at least. So, we had nationalizations of all kinds of industries, all kinds of food control, price controls, all manners of socialisms. And then in the post-war period, the logical conclusion from the British public's perspective was, right, well, we've had socialism for 5 years and I'm kind of enjoying the free stuff. So why don't we extend that to the bigger welfare state, bigger national health service, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of it, should we lay this blame on Churchill for starting the ball rolling on this kind of post-war Keynesian economic policies that many countries in the West that you outlined there are now pursuing? Do you think any of that blame lies with Churchill per se for starting the ball rolling on, certainly domestically in Britain, starting socialism off in Britain to the biggest extent which it had ever been up to World War II by that point, at least? Do you think any of that blame lies to him, or do you think it's more, no, that's not necessarily fair, he was in a war and so he had to implement that? What are your thoughts?
Well, if you take Churchill back to 1914, he was certainly keen to have a war. He was keen to go to war. He likes war, enjoys war. War's his thing. War was his thing. He didn't like peace. He wasn't a peace-loving guy. Okay, right. We're all different, aren't we? War is what he wanted. And so that started. He did some good strategic things. So he mobilized the fleet in 1914. And if we're going to go to war, it was a good thing to do was to mobilize the fleet. Then, of course, he had the disastrous strategic gamble in the Dardanelles, which was a nightmare, which kicked him out of office. So he made strategic military mistakes as well. And then, of course, we all forget he was chancellor in the 1920s, and he then tried to bring us back to the gold standard, but at the pre-war ratio of gold to sterling, which is quite obviously a stupid thing to do. I mean, an O-level economist, a kid in school could tell you that that was a stupid thing to do. But you couldn't go back. You can't do that. Now, if he recalibrated to the gold standard, and that would have been an enormous help as well, as it would have been if Roosevelt had any understanding of economics and free economics and entrepreneurialism as well. He didn't. Churchill was a very hopeless character when it came to money. He was personally always in debt. He was always being bailed out because he couldn't run his own money. So he didn't understand money. He didn't understand economics. In fact, to be brutally frank, he didn't understand very much, but he was a very charismatic leader. And of course, warfare needs a charismatic leader. And he was that man. In his defense, he never overruled any of his very senior military advisors at the end of the day. He didn't overrule most. He, generally speaking, went with his senior advisors, but when he should have stepped in, he didn't. So, for example, the disastrous carpet bombing of Germany in the second, which extended the war, because the German view basically was, if they're prepared to kill our women and children in these huge numbers with carpet bombing of our cities, there's not much point in surrendering, because these people hate our guts. These people loathe us to our very fiber of our being, not as Nazis per se, but as Germans. If we had been less horrific in our approach to that, the war could have ended earlier and on better terms. So that was another mistake. And he really didn't have much to play in the way of economics. He didn't understand economics. He wasn't very good at economics. But what the funny thing is, he managed to get himself to be Chancellor of the Exchequer with no understanding of at all of economics. And he couldn't even run his own economy.
Yeah, sorry, very quickly. I just thought of a funny joke there. That just like every Chancellor of the Exchequer since him, I think. Sorry,
exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So these people can't even run their own thing. And Rachel Reeves, I mean, she couldn't run an ice cream van. I mean, these people are hopeless. And of course, before I went into politics, which was, as an old man or getting on, late middle age, mid-50s, I assumed that these decisions would be made behind a green baize door because they knew something I didn't know. I am not privy to some information, which is why they make this decision. That isn't so. They are incredibly stupid people, full stop. They all are. There are no exceptions. It doesn't matter whether you're blue or red or Lib Dem, whatever the color of litter is. They have no idea of how to run an economy at all. None. Because they shouldn't be running it. It's not for them to run the economy. Lord Salisbury got it right. Lord Salisbury, I think it was in 1892 or something like that, said in a speech in Birmingham, my job is to facilitate the entrepreneurial spirit of the Englishman. That's my job. Not to tell him how to run his business or do this and do that. And another thing he said, of course, Lord Salisbury, was when it comes to these regulations and personalised regulations, and there was a temperance movement, we're on them at all, the temperance movement was sort of banging on and things like that. He said, it is the free-born Englishman's right to get as drunk as he likes. It's nobody else's business. And of course, in those days, it was true, because he wasn't getting drunk on his neighbour's welfare. I don't know what he was getting drunk on. Well, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for tuppence, as Hogarth, of course, said when it was a... But no, we have far too much government. We want much less government. But you won't... Why would anybody in government think there should be fewer of him and his species? Why would they think that? They all think it's good and we need more. And they won't be happy. They won't be happy until every man jack of us in this country is a civil servant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then they'll be happy. We all work for the government.
Yeah, I've seen some interesting theories since this kind of Dale Cooper Churchill controversy about who was bankrolling Churchill, and yeah, it might have been a certain nation that now demands a lot of our attention and resources from the Middle East,
You
shall we
go a lot
say?
earlier than Churchill on that one.
Well, let's not go down that rabbit hole because I certainly don't know enough
Mm.
about that one. No, you mentioned about sort of Dresden there and the bombing of German civilians, which kind of happens in the really is ramped up in like the February of 45 or so and sort of happens throughout the war. Just brutal carpet bombing, fire bombing, incendiaries, burning women and children alive, horrific. And it's not known by many people. Of course, people remember the Blitz spirit and people remember the Blitz, and rightly so. It was a terrifying time in Britain. But not many people know that on May the 15th, then, the Blitz was the bombing of civilians was initiated by Churchill's government on Germany, not the other way around. Okay, so the Blitz began in September of 40. Yeah, we first bombed Germany in May of 40. Now we know this thanks to a summary by Charles Percy Snow, who was a science advisor to the government at the time, and he actually did the maths on it. And they stated that deliberately targeting civilian working class areas was the best way to go about it. Middle class houses in Germany had too much space around them, and so you would waste too many bombs. Factories and military targets were proving too difficult to find. And so they estimated something like, well, if in a town of 50,000, were we to drop X number of bombs, we could destroy up to 50,000 houses. Um, this is so often the story that's not told about World War II and the Allied powers that, well, I'm not obviously celebrating anything that the Nazis did under their regime domestically or in any point of the war, but were we really so sure that we were the good guys when we carried out things like the firebombing of Tokyo, the bombings of Dresden, and of course dropping the A bombs as well? Were we really so sure that we were the morally justified? We were so morally justified in doing that.
Yeah, I think you make a very valid point, and of course it was Churchill that orchestrated that. And of course, you talk about Dresden, but of course Hamburg is the significantly earlier than that. But leaving that aside, the technicalities of that, we're dealing with something which didn't work. And let's look at the air crews that were lost in that. I think we lost somewhere the rate we were losing aircrew at the same rate as we were losing subalterns in the Great War in 1916, 1915. And of course, air crews were the corps d'elite, as it were. They're the best educated people. They're the young men, 19, 20. They were replaceable. It was almost like that air campaign culled. It culled the very best of the nation. The very best of the nation were aircrew, and the officer and NCO class in the army subsequently, in whether it's in North Africa or more latterly in Normandy. You're actually losing your seed corn of your next generation. And we didn't recover from that, from the Great War, which was an even bigger cull. Then there was another cull in the Second War, part two of the First War, call it what you like. And if you look at and there's been very significant study of this. If you look at the nation's IQ, quote, for example, you'll find it dips after the Great War and it dips after the Second War because you've taken away the best. You've taken away the best. And this is a sort of problem that you have, which is why I'm so anti-war. So Churchill, in fact, funny enough, when it came to decorations and monuments of aircrew, Bomber Command aircrew, of course, the monument just by Hyde Park only went up 18 years ago. That was a long time ago because we would not, as a nation, admit we had made a mistake. Bomber Harris was a psycho, who thought the war could be won by bombing women and children. We're seeing this today. We're seeing it in Palestine. You won't find a single newspaper who's telling the truth about the air campaign by Israel, the Zionists, in Palestine. I have no brief for the Palestinians one way or the other, or Israel one way or the other. But you think we'd be entitled to the truth about what's going on in Gaza, We're not getting the truth at all. It's airbrushed out. The whole thing's been airbrushed. This murder of thousands of women and children in Gaza. But nobody's talking about it. Why aren't they talking about it? When you look at who owns the newspapers, who owns corporate media, etc., which takes a full circle to back about who really runs these countries and Western media in North America and here. Make up your own mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the justification, though. I mean, we had to bomb Dresden and Hamburg because, these were the people that supported the Nazis, and these were the people that voted Hitler into power, and this was the only way to do it. And it's the same justification today we're seeing with Palestine. These were the people that support Hamas and voted Hamas in, even though, over 50% of the population of Gaza is under 18, and so wouldn't have been able to vote in the election that elected Palestine back in 2005 anyway. And the same with Germany in, 1945 as well. Well, I guess that's kind of made me think about the American perspective on this, really. I mean, we've kind of outlined that the British were very clear losers in terms of their objectives of this war, but one group that certainly weren't were the Americans, of course. So we were obviously talking there about how the fact that the Nazis, the Imperial Japanese, were so evil and committed such atrocities during the war, it gave such a fantastic cover to the Allies to enable them to, commit their own acts of atrocities, such as bombing civilians and dropping the atomic bomb. Because, of course, World War II is the origin story of the American empire. The founders of American mythology. I don't think people no longer regard, Washington, Jefferson, maybe Abe Lincoln as the founders anymore. I think now it's FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, and World War II is the mythology. I'm using it in the kind of the Greek term there, as in, the thing in which a nation needs to justify itself and its policies. World War II is the mythology behind, well, every American foreign policy objective after the war and the post-war liberal consensus, because everyone is the new Hitler. Okay, let's just look at the 21st century. Saddam is Hitler with a WMD, and so we have to invade Iraq. Gaddafi is going to genocide his own people in Libya, so we have to intervene. Assad was gassing his own people in Syria, so we have to back the rebels in Syria, even though they had links to Al Qaeda. And now, of course, Putin is going to march on Poland next, and then once Poland falls, then it's the rest of Europe. Okay, it's the basis, the origin story of the American empire is World War II. I don't know, did you have anything to add on sort of the American importance of the myth of Churchill and the myth of World War II writ large at all?
Well, it's an interesting concept insofar as that I think I'm right in saying that the United States has been at war with somebody for every year of its history, bar about 17 years. They are always at war. It is a nation of war. And if you look at late 19th century Prussia, for example, the whole country, Prussia was a militaristic nation with different laws from senior military people, different economic systems, the suppression of the views of the other people in the Federation of Germany, like Saxony and Westphalia, and so on and so forth. So we now have that. Which is totally against the concept of George Washington, of course. It was keep your nose out of anywhere else, just keep our own patch, as it were. And that was where the formation of the Constitution. It didn't last long because America is a war economy. It's a bellicose economy. And so Congress is bought lock, stock and barrel by the war machine. And it's run for the Industrial Military Congressional Congress, of which Eisenhower warned us in 1990. In 1960, he said this will happen, and it's growing, and it will pervert science. The budgets will be huge. It's now $1 trillion. We don't know what the CIA gets, which is the CIA is a fundamentally evil institution. It's fundamentally evil. It's war after war after war. But you see, and I was at the RCDS with lots of American officers, senior American officers of one-star rank, and very nice guys. Very nice. I got on with them very well. Got a lot of friends there, as you do meet at college, military college. None of them had a bloody clue about what their war aims were. If you talk about war aims, so I talked about the 1812, the Anglo-American War of 1812. They didn't have a clue. What they don't have war aims, you see, and this is the point. They don't have war aims because war is the end game itself. It doesn't matter whether they win or lose, as long as the war machines are producing and making money, billions of dollars to the Ukraine, that comes straight back into the war machine. Now, we've gone along with that, and I would argue we went along with that again far too much. I mean, Churchill was wedded to the Americans for understandable strategic reasons. He had to keep them. The Americans were very largely responsible for the war with Japan. It was very this business all of a sudden out of nowhere. We were minding our own business and they bombed Pearl Harbor. Bullshit! It's bullshit. The Americans provoked and provoked and provoked. That they were canny enough to make sure that most of their carriers were at sea when they struck. All this now is in the domain of any military historian who understands this. It's America encouraged it, and Churchill went along with it. He went along with NATO. NATO, which of course is now, I can't blame Churchill for all this, but the seed corn was there, is now an aggressive organization. NATO is an expansionist organization, and this is what the Ukraine's all about. But so far, very few American soldiers or airmen have been killed when it comes to the Ukraine. So consequently, they don't have a Vietnam scenario where people are dying and they're paying the cost. They're just paying in printed dollars at the moment, and America's asleep. But your American electorate, in the main, and I've got lots of American friends, it doesn't apply to them if you're watching this clip, the average American voter is incredibly stupid. You know, they are really stupid. You know, they vote Democrat in this state and they vote Republican in that state, and that's how it's going to be. And we have seen, of course, in this country, if you live on a working class estate in the north of England, you vote Labour. Now, that just suddenly stopped. That stopped for a while. And of course, the Conservative Party dropped the pass. It was the Conservative Party dropped the pass. Instead of embracing these people and making their life easier, it didn't. We carried on with left-wing woke policies. And so the working class now in these years abandoned. They gone back to Labour. And they're picking up the tab now for it because they see sort of psychos that they've got in office with Labour. I think, to go back to the original question, I don't think that you can lay all of this on Churchill. You can lay it more on much lesser known names like Maynard Keynes and people like that, and governors of the Bank of England in the latter days, and the acceptance of a form of socialism. We haven't seen a truly capitalistic free market political party. They call it a mixed economy. We're in favor of mixed economy. Not really. That isn't how it is. They are socialists. Everybody in Parliament, with very few exceptions today, and this is before the election, is a socialist. Every single man, I know them. I've met them all. I've had drinks with them. I've had lunch with them. They are socialists with a small s. Mm-hmm. And they believe in government interference, government handouts, all the rest of it. The whole thing just goes on, and there's no way out of it that I can see. There's no way out of it I can see. We all know, everybody watching this clip will know, we could stop the boats tomorrow morning by mobilizing the Royal Navy and towing them back. It's given. Easy peasy. But suddenly people start talking about international marine law. What's that got to do when your country is being invaded by illegal immigrants of whom we know nothing? And we're talking about, oh, well, we can't tow them out because international law. What kind of spineless, moronic muppets run this country? But, of course, we need to tell the truth again. It's all quite deliberate. It's all quite deliberate. All this mass immigration isn't wringing our hands because there's nothing we can do because we're part of the European Court of Human Rights. It's bullshit. It's because it's designed to degrade our country, degrade our institutions, so the World Economic Forum can take one pace further to global government. That's what it's all about. That's the key. And it was just the same with the Conservatives as it is with this lot.
Absolutely, yeah. One thing I will challenge you on that you said earlier then, and this will be my last question, and I've got to bounce, about state educators and state history teachers. I am a state educator. I'm a state history teacher. Not by choice, really. I love history and I'm very passionate about it. If I could work outside of the state, maybe perhaps I would. As a history teacher, how should I be teaching World War II and Churchill? Just to kind of summarize our conversation, how should I tell a 13 and 14-year-old about World War II? Just a few moments just to wrap it all up.
Well, of course, first of all, I know that you are the exception that proves the rule, and that goes without saying. So I was sweeping with rather a broad brush. But I would encourage the teaching of history. I would go back to the concept of A.J.P. Taylor, whose economic views, of course, I didn't agree with at all. But let's talk about from being a professional historian, as you are. You are a professional historian, as I am myself. So how should you teach? How should you teach kids? I would say you have to let them come to you give them the facts. You give them the bald facts and let them come to their own decision. So but the trouble is, of course, you're having to get your kids through an exam. You're actually dealing with a box ticking. I wouldn't start from here like the Irishman from Kerry. I would say, if I were examining children in history, with the state certification situation, I would say, right, here's your exam. It's 3 hours. You can write three essays or two essays in those 3 hours on any historical subject you like of the Great Britain, and let them write 2,002 essays of, say, 2,000 words, and I would judge them on that and their views and their historical accuracy. I don't think you should teach history. I think you should open up history to people to make their own decisions and find out things for themselves. It's a wonderful journey. History and British history and there's loads of wonderful books outside the academic sphere, or the state academic sphere. There's wonderful books. I mean, you could do worse and go right back to Trevelyan and people like that. But there are modern authors, and you can get them on Kindle, and they just set out, this is what happened. This is how it was. And here are the numbers. And here's the situation. And then my experience of youngsters, which is not insignificant, but usually in the way of sport or something, or sponsorship at Cambridge University and all that kind of thing, is they're actually much cleverer than we give them credit for. And if you feed that fact into them and you don't skew the facts and you're prepared to concede that not everything is good, like I do, not everything the British Empire was good. Of course it wasn't. No empire in the history of this planet was all good or all bad. Yes, you've got this. Yes, you've got that. Make your own decision. And then children will then embark. They will embark on the concept of history and the history of their own island. And of course, what you can't do, which I suppose the state wants you to do in their own curriculum stuff, what you really can't do is try and get kids to believe that the Second War started in 1939. I mean, that's bullshit. It's bullshit. So when did the so-called Second War really start? Well, your kids have got to go back to at least 1910 to find out how that came. You can't suddenly go, oh, Munich was here, and that isn't history. That's just completely ludicrous, ridiculous nonsense. So that's what I would suggest, is that you say, how did it come about? When did all this come about? But you've got to start in your block. Where would you start that piece of history? Say, where did it start? You might say 1910, 1902. You might actually say the Boer War, for example. What did that trigger? But you've got to go back. But this problem of taking things out of context is a nightmare. And historians and the state does it. You've got to take that piece out like it's not connected. The Reform Bill. I've got a nephew who was at Newcastle University who was doing the Reform Bill and hadn't covered the French Revolution. How can you possibly evaluate that? How can you evaluate the reform bills if you haven't taken it in the context of the French Revolution just across the water 30 years earlier. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
but this is what he got a 2-1. He got a 2-1 at Newcastle University. He's not a historian. He's a good rugby player and a good drinker. And he's the first to admit it, incidentally. He's the first to admit it. Historian, my ass.
I'll leave it there if you don't mind, Mr. Bloom. Then that's a very good way to finish, I think. Right. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
A great pleasure as always.
Awesome. Right. Catch you next time, folks. Peace.
As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research-based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.